The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. King Charles walked slowly down the familiar corridor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The castle felt unusually peaceful today, with most of the family away on their respective duties and engagements. Charles had always found solace in these quiet moments, when the weight of the crown seemed lighter, and he could simply be a grandfather, a father, a man with memories both bitter and sweet. Today, something drew him toward the east wing of the castle, where the family's private quarters housed the children's playrooms and nurseries. As he approached the nursery that had once belonged to Prince Louis, Charles felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The door stood slightly ajar, just as it had been left after the family's recent visit. William and Catherine had brought all three children for a weekend stay, and the castle had been alive with laughter, running footsteps, and the delightful chaos that only young children could create. Charles pushed the door open gently, stepping into the room that held so many precious memories. The nursery was decorated in soft blues and whites, with wooden toys scattered across the carpet and picture books stacked on low shelves. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The room smelled faintly of lavender, and the particular scent that seemed to cling to all children's spaces. A mixture of innocence, play, and unconditional love. Charles breathed it in deeply, remembering similar moments from when William and Harry were young, when he would find them in their nursery at Highgrove, building elaborate castles with wooden blocks, or engaged in animated conversations with their stuffed animals. His eyes swept across the familiar space, taking in the details that spoke of Louis's recent presence. A red toy fire engine sat abandoned near the window, its tiny ladder extended as if frozen mid-rescue. Crayons were scattered across a small table, evidence of artistic endeavors that had likely involved more enthusiasm than technique. A pile of picture books lay open on the reading chair, their colorful illustrations still beckoning for another story time. But it was something else that caught Charles's attention and made him pause in the doorway. Near the foot of the small bed, partially hidden beneath a hand-knitted blanket, lay a wooden toy train. It was a simple thing, painted in bright primary colors with wheels that had been worn smooth by countless hours of play. The train looked as though it had been abandoned mid-journey, perhaps when Louis had been called away for lunch or bath time. Charles approached the toy slowly, his heart beginning to race for reasons he couldn't quite explain. As he knelt down beside the bed, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. When he reached out to touch the wooden train, he could feel warmth emanating from its surface. Not the ambient warmth of a room heated by sunlight, but the distinct warmth that comes from recent human contact, from small hands that had been gripping and playing with love and imagination. The realization hit him like a gentle wave. Louis had been playing with this very toy perhaps only hours ago, before the family had departed for London. The child's essence, his energy and warmth, still lingered in this simple wooden train. Charles picked up the toy carefully, cradling it in his weathered hands as if it were made of the most precious material. Sitting on the edge of the small bed, Charles examined the train more closely. He could see tiny scratches and dents that spoke of countless adventures. There were faint marks where Louis's teeth had left impressions during his teething phase, and places where the paint had worn away from constant handling. This wasn't just a toy. It was a repository of childhood memories, a witness to the imagination and joy of his youngest grandson. Charles found himself smiling as he imagined Louis playing with the train just hours earlier. He could picture the 5-year-old prince on his hands and knees, making engine sounds as he pushed the toy across the carpet, creating elaborate scenarios where the train rescued other toys or transported precious cargo to distant lands. Perhaps Louis had been the conductor, calling out stops at imaginary stations. Or maybe he had been a passenger on a grand adventure, to places that existed only in the boundless world of a child's imagination. The warmth of the toy seemed to transfer to Charles's hands, and with it came a flood of emotions he hadn't expected. He thought about his own childhood, about the toys that had meant everything to him, and how they had eventually been packed away and forgotten. He thought about William and Harry's childhoods, about the toys and games they had loved, and how quickly those precious years had passed. But mostly, he thought about Louis and the other grandchildren who had brought such unexpected joy to his later years. George, with his serious demeanor and growing sense of responsibility, Charlotte with her spirited personality and quick wit, and Louis with his infectious laughter and boundless curiosity. These children had given him a second chance at experiencing the pure magic of childhood, this time from the perspective of someone who understood how fleeting and precious these moments truly were. As Charles sat in the quiet nursery, holding the warm wooden train, he felt a profound connection not just to Louis, but to the eternal cycle of family, love, and memory that bound them all together. The toy in his hands was more than wood and paint. It was a bridge between generations, a tangible reminder that love could be felt through the simplest of objects. Outside the nursery windows, the gardens of Windsor stretched out in their full summer glory. Gardeners moved quietly among the flower beds, tending to the roses that would soon bloom in magnificent displays of color and fragrance. Life continued its eternal rhythm, but in this moment, in this sacred space where childhood lived and breathed, Charles felt time stand still. He closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. He remembered his own grandfather, King George VI, and the rare moments when the stern monarch had shown his gentler side with a small Prince Charles. He thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she had balanced the demands of the crown with the tender moments of motherhood and grandmotherhood. Now, he was the grandfather, the patriarch of this continuing story, and the responsibility felt both overwhelming and profoundly meaningful. The wooden train grew cooler in his hands as the minutes passed. But Charles was reluctant to put it down. This simple object had become a meditation, a prayer, a promise. It represented everything he hoped for: his grandchildren, happiness, security, imagination, and the freedom to be children for as long as possible in a world that would someday demand so much of them. As the afternoon light began to shift, casting longer shadows across the nursery floor, Charles finally stood up from the small bed. He placed the wooden train carefully on the windowsill, positioning it so that it caught the last rays of sunlight. Perhaps Louis would notice it there when he returned. Perhaps he would remember exactly where he had left it. Or perhaps he would discover it anew and create fresh adventures. Charles took one last look around the nursery, memorizing every detail of this moment. The scattered toys, the rumpled bedding, the books waiting to be read again. All of it spoke of a life being lived fully, joyfully, and with the complete abandon that only children could achieve. Tomorrow, this room would be cleaned and organized, ready for the next visit. But right now, it was perfect in its beautiful chaos, a testament to the love and laughter that had filled it so recently. Standing in the doorway, Charles felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. For this room, for this moment, for the privilege of being not just a king, but a grandfather who could still feel the warmth of a child's love through a simple wooden toy. 3 days had passed since Charles's discovery in the nursery, yet the memory of the warm wooden train continued to occupy his thoughts. He found himself returning to that room each morning during his private time, not to disturb anything, but simply to stand quietly and remember the feeling of connection he had experienced. On this particular morning, Charles decided to take a different path through the castle. Instead of his usual route through the staterooms, he walked through the family corridors where portraits of ancestors gazed down from gilded frames. These hallways told the story of the Windsor family through generations, and today Charles felt particularly aware of his place in that continuing narrative. As he approached the nursery, he heard something unexpected: the soft sound of voices coming from within. His heart lifted immediately, thinking perhaps William and Catherine had returned early with the children. But as he drew closer, he realized the voices belonged to Mrs. Henderson, the longtime housekeeper, and young Sarah, one of the newer members of the household staff. Charles paused outside the door, not wanting to interrupt but curious about their conversation. Through the partially open door, he could see Mrs. Henderson showing Sarah how to properly care for the children's belongings. The older woman, who had served the royal family for over 30 years, moved through the room with practiced efficiency. But Charles noticed something tender in her movements as she handled each toy and book. "You see, dear," Mrs. Henderson was saying to Sarah, "each of these items tells a story. This little fire engine belongs to Prince Louis. He never goes anywhere without it when he visits. And this teddy bear has been with Princess Charlotte since she was barely walking. You must handle everything with care. Not because they're expensive, but because they're precious to the children." Charles watched as Mrs. Henderson picked up the very wooden train he had held just days before. She examined it with the same gentle attention he had shown, turning it over in her weathered hands. "This train," she continued, "is Prince Louis's absolute favorite. I've seen him play with it for hours, creating whole worlds and adventures. The Prince of Wales told me it was his first real toy, a gift for his first Christmas." Sarah nodded attentively, clearly understanding the importance of what she was being taught. "How do you remember all of these details about each child's preferences?" she asked. Mrs. Henderson smiled, an expression that transformed her usually stern features into something warm and maternal. "When you care for a family the way I've cared for this one, you notice everything. I've watched Prince William grow from a shy little boy into the man he is today. I was here when Prince Harry took his first steps in this very room, and now I have the privilege of seeing the next generation discover the same joys their fathers once knew." She moved to the bookshelf, straightening the volumes with careful precision. "Prince George loves the adventure stories. Anything with knights or pirates captures his imagination. Princess Charlotte prefers the fairy tales, but not the traditional ones. She likes the modern versions where the princesses save themselves. And Prince Louis? Well, he loves anything with trains, trucks, or animals. He's particularly fond of the story about the little engine that could." Charles felt a warmth spreading through his chest as he listened to Mrs. Henderson's observations. Here was someone who had dedicated her life to caring for his family, who noticed and remembered the small details that made each child unique. Her love for the family was evident in every word, every gentle gesture as she moved through the nursery. "The king himself comes here sometimes, Mrs. Henderson continued, and Charles straightened with surprise. "I've seen him standing in the doorway, just watching and remembering. This room holds special meaning for him, I think. Perhaps it reminds him of his own children when they were small, or perhaps it helps him feel connected to these little ones when they're not here." Sarah glanced around the room with new understanding. "It must be difficult for him, being separated from his grandchildren so often because of his duties. Oh, my dear, you have no idea how much His Majesty treasures his time with these children," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice filled with warmth. "When they're here, he becomes a different person. I've seen him on his hands and knees playing trains with Prince Louis, teaching Prince George about the gardens, and listening patiently to Princess Charlotte's elaborate stories about her stuffed animals. These moments are precious to him." Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had no idea that his staff had observed these intimate moments, or that they understood the deep joy his grandchildren brought to his life. For so many years, the demands of royal duty had kept him at a distance from his own sons during their childhood. The crown required sacrifices, and one of the greatest had been missing countless bedtime stories, playground adventures, and quiet family moments. But with his grandchildren, Charles had been determined to be different. He had made a conscious choice to be present, to prioritize these relationships, even when duty called. Every moment spent with George, Charlotte, and Louis was intentional, precious, and deeply cherished. Mrs. Henderson continued her instruction, moving to the window where the wooden train sat exactly as Charles had left it days before. "I noticed this train had been moved recently," she said thoughtfully. "His Majesty must have been here, touching the children's things, remembering. I left it where he placed it because I understand. Sometimes we all need to hold on to something that connects us to the people we love." The profound wisdom in the housekeeper's words struck Charles deeply. Here was a woman who had spent decades observing the royal family, who understood the emotional undercurrents that flowed beneath the formal facade of royal life. She had witnessed the loneliness that could come with the crown, the sacrifices required by duty, and the deep human need for connection and love. Sarah picked up one of Louis's picture books and flipped through its well-worn pages. "The pictures are all marked up with crayon," she observed. "Never try to clean those marks, Mrs. Henderson warned quickly. "Those scribbles are treasures. Each one represents a moment when Prince Louis was engaged with a story, when his imagination was running wild. His parents have specifically asked that we leave his artwork intact. They understand that these marks are part of his childhood, part of what makes these books special to him. Charles thought about the many times he had read to Louis from that very book, watching as the little boy pointed to pictures and asked endless questions about the characters and their adventures. Those crayon marks weren't vandalism. They were evidence of curiosity, creativity, and the wonderful way children made everything their own. As the two women continued their work, Charles found himself thinking about his own childhood at Buckingham Palace in Windsor. The staff who had cared for him had been kind but formal, maintaining the proper distance that protocol required. Toys had been expensive and educational, carefully chosen for their appropriateness rather than their appeal to a child's imagination. There had been little tolerance for the kind of creative mess that Louis was encouraged to make. Charles had tried to give William and Harry a different kind of childhood, but the pressures of his role as heir to the throne had often interfered. Now, as king, he had even greater responsibilities, but he also had greater authority to choose how to balance those duties with his personal relationships. His grandchildren would know their grandfather not just as a monarch, but as someone who valued their happiness above protocol, their laughter above formality. Mrs. Henderson was now teaching Sarah about the children's bedtime routines. When Prince Louis stays overnight, he requires his train, this specific blanket that his mother knitted for him, and at least 3 stories before he'll settle down. He's particular about how his pillows are arranged, and he likes to have a small nightlight on because he's afraid of the dark. Charles smiled, remembering the previous month when Louis had insisted on sleeping in the nursery rather than in one of the grander guest bedrooms. The little prince had been adamant that his toys needed to be close by, and Charles had personally helped him arrange everything just right. They had ended up having an impromptu sleepover, with Charles reading stories long into the night until Louis finally drifted off to sleep. The king stayed with him that entire night, Mrs. Henderson continued, as if reading Charles's thoughts. I brought them both breakfast in bed the next morning. His Majesty was still in his pajamas, playing trains on the bed with Prince Louis. It was one of the most beautiful sights I've ever witnessed in all my years of service. That morning had indeed been special. Charles had awakened to find Louis already up and playing quietly with his toys, trying not to wake his grandfather. When Charles had opened his eyes, Louis had whispered, "Good morning, Grandpapa. I'm being very quiet like Mama taught me." They had spent the early hours before breakfast, creating elaborate train routes across the bed, with Louis providing enthusiastic sound effects and Charles marveling at his grandson's boundless imagination. As Mrs. Henderson and Sarah finished organizing the nursery and prepared to leave, Charles stepped back into an alcove to avoid being seen. He wanted to preserve the privacy of their conversation, but he also needed a moment to process everything he had overheard. The depth of care and understanding that Mrs. Henderson showed for his family moved him profoundly. After the women had gone, Charles entered the nursery once more. The room felt different now, infused with the knowledge that he wasn't the only one who recognized its special significance. The staff who cared for this space understood that they were tending to more than just a room. They were preserving the sacred space where childhood lived and memories were made. He walked to the window and picked up the wooden train once more. It was cool now, but holding it brought back the memory of its warmth, the tangible connection to Louis that had started this entire journey of reflection. Charles realized that this simple toy had become a symbol of something much larger. The unbreakable bonds of family, the precious nature of childhood, and the responsibility he bore not just as a king, but as a grandfather who wanted to leave his grandchildren with memories of love, attention, and genuine care. A week later, Charles received the news he had been hoping for. William called to say that the family would be returning to Windsor for the weekend, and this time they were planning an extended stay. Catherine wanted to spend time in the gardens with the children, and William thought it would be good for them to have some quiet family time away from the pressures of London. Charles felt his spirits lift immediately. The castle had seemed too quiet without the children's voices echoing through its corridors. He began making plans in his mind. Perhaps he could show Louis the new railway garden that the groundskeepers had been working on. Or maybe they could visit the horses in the stable. The possibilities seemed endless, and Charles found himself looking forward to the weekend with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. On Friday afternoon, Charles positioned himself in his study with a clear view of the main courtyard, watching for the arrival of his family. When the familiar black Range Rover finally pulled through the gates, his heart began to race with excitement. He forced himself to remain seated for a few minutes, maintaining the dignity expected of a monarch. But his resolve crumbled quickly when he heard Charlotte's voice calling his name from the entrance hall. By the time Charles reached the main staircase, all three children were racing toward him with the unbridled enthusiasm that only grandchildren could display. Charlotte reached him first, launching herself into his arms with complete confidence that he would catch her. George followed more sedately, but his smile was just as bright, and Louis, still small enough to need help with the larger steps, toddled toward him with his arms outstretched and something clutched tightly in his right hand. "Grandpapa! Grandpapa!" Louis called out, his voice filled with pure joy. "I brought something special to show you." Charles knelt down to Louis's level, gathering the little boy into a warm embrace. "What have you brought me, my dear boy?" he asked, his voice soft with affection. Louis opened his small fist to reveal not one, but two wooden trains. Along with the familiar train Charles had held the week before, there was a new one, slightly smaller, painted in different colors, but clearly part of the same family of toys. "This is Thomas," Louis announced seriously, holding up the train Charles recognized. "And this is James. They're best friends, just like me and George." He glanced at his older brother, who rolled his eyes good-naturedly but couldn't suppress a smile. "I see," Charles said, examining both trains with the gravity that Louis's presentation deserved. "And what adventures do Thomas and James have together?" Louis's eyes lit up with excitement. "Oh, Grandpapa, they have the most wonderful adventures. Thomas is very brave, and James is very smart, and together they help people and rescue animals and explore magical places. Would you like to see? Would you like to see?" Before Charles could answer, Louis was tugging on his hand, leading him toward the stairs. William and Catherine exchanged amused glances as they watched their youngest son commandeer the King of England for an immediate play session. "Perhaps we should let Grandpapa settle in first," Catherine suggested gently. But Charles was already being pulled up the stairs by Louis's determined grip. "Nonsense," Charles called back over his shoulder. "Royal business can wait. Thomas and James have adventures to share." When they reached the nursery, Charles was amazed to see how quickly Louis transformed the space. Within minutes, the little boy had created an elaborate landscape using pillows, books, and various toys. Blankets became hills and valleys, a row of blocks became a bridge, and stuffed animals became passengers waiting at stations along the route. "You see, Grandpapa," Louis explained with the utmost seriousness, "the trains have to work together because the track is very long, and sometimes one train gets tired, but when they help each other, they can go anywhere they want." Charles settled himself on the carpet beside Louis, his formal clothing forgotten as he entered completely into his grandson's world. For the next hour, he became the voice of James, while Louis operated Thomas, and together they created stories of friendship, cooperation, and adventure. During one particularly elaborate rescue mission involving Charlotte's stuffed rabbit, Charles found himself thinking about the warm train he had discovered the week before. Here was the explanation for that warmth. It wasn't just the heat from Louis's hands, but the love and imagination that the child poured into his play. Every adventure, every story, every carefully planned route around the nursery floor was infused with the boundless creativity and earnest emotion that made childhood so magical. As they played, other family members began to drift into the nursery. Charlotte joined in, creating voices for the various animal passengers, while George, despite his attempts to appear too mature for such games, found himself drawn into the elaborate scenarios Louis was creating. William sat in the chair by the window, watching his children and father play together with an expression of deep contentment. Catherine appeared with tea for the adults and juice boxes for the children, and she settled cross-legged on the floor beside Charles. "I hope you don't mind that Louis brought his entire train collection," she said with a laugh. "He's been talking about showing them to you all week." "Mind?" Charles looked up from where he was, carefully maneuvering James around a particularly challenging curve made from building blocks. This is exactly what I hoped for. I hoped for. As the afternoon progressed, Charles began to understand something profound about Louis's relationship with his toys. The trains weren't just objects to the child. They were characters in an ongoing narrative, friends who accompanied him on journeys both real and imagined. When Louis played with Thomas and James, he was practicing empathy, problem-solving, and storytelling. He was learning about friendship, cooperation, and the power of imagination to transform the ordinary world into something magical. During a break in the play, while Louis was carefully rearranging his landscape for a new adventure, Charles found himself in quiet conversation with William and Catherine. They spoke about the children's development, their personalities, and the joy they brought to everyone around them. Louis has always been particularly attached to his trains, Catherine explained. When he was going through a difficult patch with nightmares last year, holding his train would calm him down immediately. There's something about the stability of the toy, the fact that it's always there for him, that gives him comfort. Reserum. Charles thought about this insight as he watched Louis methodically setting up another elaborate scene. The wooden train wasn't just a toy. It was a source of security, a tangible reminder that some things in his small world were constant and reliable. In a life that would eventually be shaped by royal duties and public expectations, these simple pleasures and comforts were invaluable. As evening approached and the time came for baths and bedtime stories, Louis carefully gathered his trains and placed them on the windowsill beside his bed. Charles watched this ritual with new understanding. The child was ensuring that his friends would be safe through the night, ready for new adventures in the morning. "Grandpapa," Louis said as Catherine began to run his bath, "will you tell me a story tonight? About Thomas and James? When they were young trains?" Charles felt his heart swell with emotion. "Of course, my dear boy. I'd be honored to tell you their story." Later that night, as Charles sat beside Louis's bed in the dimly lit nursery, he began to weave a tale about two young trains who lived in a magical railway station. He spoke about their friendship, their adventures, and the important lessons they learned about kindness, courage, and helping others. Louis listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting with questions or suggestions for the story. When Louis finally drifted off to sleep, his small hand was curled around Thomas, the train that had started this entire journey for Charles. The king sat quietly for a few more minutes, watching his grandson's peaceful face in the soft glow of the nightlight. In that moment, Charles understood that the warmth he had felt in the train the week before wasn't just residual heat from a child's touch. It was love made manifest. The physical embodiment of the joy, security, and endless imagination that Louis poured into everything he touched. The toy train was warm because it was cherished, because it was part of a childhood filled with wonder and possibility. As Charles finally stood to leave the nursery, he took one last look around the room. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new stories, and new memories. The trains would travel to distant lands, rescue more animals, and overcome whatever challenges Louis's imagination could conjure. And Charles would be there, ready to play whatever role his grandson assigned him in these precious games. Walking back through the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, Charles reflected on the unexpected gift that had come from stepping into an empty nursery and discovering a warm toy train. That simple moment had opened his eyes to the profound importance of being truly present for his grandchildren, of understanding their world on their terms, and of recognizing that the greatest treasures in life often came in the smallest packages. The wooden train would continue to hold its warmth, not from the sun or from small hands, but from the love that surrounded it. And Charles would continue to be grateful for the privilege of sharing in these magical years, when imagination ruled supreme, and a simple toy could connect hearts across generations. In a life filled with ceremony and duty, these moments of pure connection reminded him that he was not just a king, but a grandfather who had been entrusted with some of the most precious hearts in his kingdom.